Did Joe Exotic hire Alan Glover to murder Carole Baskin? Did Carole Baskin murder her husband Don Lewis and feed him to tigers? And what the heck was going on with all of these people across multiple states over multiple decades? If you're a regular of the channel, welcome back. It's good to see you again. But if you're not familiar with us, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Robert Gruler. I am a criminal defense attorney in Scottsdale, Arizona. My team and I have helped literally thousands of people facing criminal charges, people from all over the world. They come to Arizona, they get in trouble, and they need some help. So over the years, I've seen many things. I've seen a lot of different types of cases, a lot of different types of people, and I've never seen anything quite like the Tiger King. When I watched this series, my eyebrows definitely furrowed a little bit more than usual. And so what I did is I stopped watching the series at about episode 2, started all the way over, and I put my lawyer hat on, my criminal defense attorney hat on, to do a deep dive analysis on the Tiger King, on all of the different issues that are going on throughout the series. And as I was watching, I was taking notes and I was treating it as I would treat a regular case that I was investigating. And here's what we came up with. There's a lot here. So I've put together 97 slides. I've addressed and analyzed 53 different individuals, and we've covered 10 legal issues. And at the end, we're going to get down to 2 conclusions, really answering both of those questions that I opened the video with. Today, however, we're just going to focus on the one. Did Joe Exotic hire Alan Glover to kill Carole Baskin? We're going to start there. Now, before we dive into it, again, I want to just run through very quickly my credentials. Who the heck is this guy? You see a bunch of stuff on my walls behind me, but let me just show you who I am and what I do. So I am a licensed lawyer. I passed the bar in 2 different states, and I'm admitted in 4 different locations. We've got 7 lawyers at our firm. I've written a book on the topic, and so I've spent a lot of my time in the criminal space. And we're going to really dive through some pretty heavy nuts and bolts here. We're going to dive through some case law. We're going to analyze some legal issues, all to answer the question, to come to a conclusion: did Joe Exotic actually hire Alan Glover to kill Carole Baskin? He was convicted of it, but did he actually do it? We're going to dive into that. So before we get there, let me just explain a little bit of what I call my analytical framework. So this was 7 episodes. It was a lot of material, and there's some things that I'm covering and some things that I'm not going to cover. Here's what it looks like, just so you have an understanding. I want to be sure that we're sort of all speaking the same language. So what I did is I watched all of the different episodes, all 7 of them. I did not go to episode 8. Okay, I know there was an episode 8 that was recently released, but what I did is I wanted to limit myself to sort of the universe of the series only. I didn't want to dive into a bunch of stuff. You can go down a rabbit hole looking at, I have seen some additional news sources saying that they're opening investigations and Joe Exotic's a racist and all that stuff. I've done my very best to limit my consumption of those materials so that I could give a raw, sort of authentic analysis of really what happened in the Tiger King. So no external news sources, no listening to other people's reviews. I know a lot of people have made videos on Tiger King. I have not watched any of them. I have people sending them to me. They know that I'm working on this video today, and I just haven't watched any of them. I'm also not looking into criminal case law. I'm not really doing much legal research, and I'm really having very brief conversations with our team here at the office. Some people have watched it and some people haven't. So I'm trying to keep it raw. I'm trying to keep it authentic. So that's what we're talking about. If there's been other things that have happened in the Tiger King world, I probably haven't seen them. So if you see something in this video and you have some information that contradicts it directly, I probably just haven't seen it. Leave me a comment. I fully intend to kind of continue to explore these types of issues, and so we'll be able to talk about those in a later video. But today, we're keeping it really tight. Some other things, as part of my framework of analyzing things, we are not going to cover animal abuse. Okay, we're just not going to cover it. I'm not an expert on the Endangered Species Act, and we saw a ton of it. We saw these animals getting abused and treated very poorly throughout the entire series, and so it would be pretty obvious for me to say, yeah, there was probably some criminality going on there. So we're just not going to cover that. There were some major other criminal legal matters that were going on in the series. Things like sex trafficking and grooming. We saw that with Doc. We saw that with Joe Exotic. We saw that with a lot of different people throughout the series. We saw a ton of drug use. There was a whole segment in the show about trademark and copyright infringement. We're not going to cover that. Same with arson. Joe allegedly burnt down his own studio, and we're just not going to cover that. It's just not that interesting to me. it is interesting. It's not as interesting as some of the other questions. And so for the sake of time, we're just not going to cover that. We're also not going to cover any of the threatening and intimidating that has been going on or any of the campaign violations. There really is so much criminal law that took place in this series that I could probably spend an entire semester on it, which I'm just not interested in doing yet. So maybe one day. But another quick point, quick disclaimer. My analysis is only based on the series. I've already covered that. The opinions and conclusions that I share with you are, of course, not our firm's, and the conclusions are subject to change. So this may be something that I evolve on as I learn more. So I just wanted to throw those out quickly. Now, another quick point on that, there are attorneys who are in the show. There are a lot of people who are involved in the actual behind the scenes of the show, and I just don't know really what they did. Most of what I'm talking about here is speculation based on the series, based on what I watched. Haven't spoken to any of those people. So if I come to conclusions and they seem harsh or they seem, a little bit sort of insulting to a certain extent, then, I apologize in advance, but I'm just operating based off of the series itself. So if any of those people have an issue, I'm more than happy to talk to them about it, but just so that we have that clear. Okay, so now that's out of the way. Let's dive into the major first issue, right? Did Joe commit the crime of murder for hire? So this was a really big part of the series that we kind of didn't get to until episode 6 or 7 when it all kind of came together. The first episodes 1 through 5 were a lot of groundwork. It was a lot about the sort of the backdrop of Joe, shooting Carole in a TV series and, shooting her mannequins on the side of the river and so on and so forth. But there was a lot that was not covered specifically about the murder for hire. It wasn't until they brought the prosecutor in right at about episode 6 where they started talking about this a lot more. And really episodes 1 through 5 were sort of leading up to that. So this is the issue that we're going to spend a lot of time on. Did Joe commit murder for hire? Did he hire Alan to actually go and kill Carole? There's a lot of legal issues wrapped up into that one question. And so before we dive into the meat and potatoes of the entire presentation, what I want to do is go over a quick rule with you. So there's a rule of evidence that says that only relevant evidence can actually be sort of admitted into court. So if it's not relevant, the court's not going to hear it. And the rule is actually the Rule 401. It looks like this. Evidence is relevant if it has any tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence, and the fact is of consequence in determining the action. So that's the Rule 401. It's a big rule. We spend a lot of time in it. What's important for you as a viewer, as a non-lawyer to know, is that basically we're going to try to talk about relevant things. There are some things that I'm going to talk about today that are not super relevant, but they're relevant enough that I wanted to include them for the sake of thoroughness and just so that we can have kind of a jumping off point if anybody has any points they want to make as to that one specific individual. This was a fast-paced documentary. It moved very quickly. As I said, there were about 53 people who were in the series in total. Today on this issue, we're not going to get to all 53. We're going to get to about half of them, maybe a little bit more than half. Those are the people who are relevant to what we're talking about. So Rule 401, relevance. Now, what I have done in this presentation is I've actually sort of whittled down and gotten rid of a lot of the irrelevant stuff that I took a look at and said, that is not pertinent to this issue, to this one issue. Did Joe Exotic hire Alan Glover to kill Carole Baskin? If it's not relevant to that, I've kind of just brushed it aside. You may think that something is relevant or not. If you do, we can have a discussion about that. So the rules of evidence, I did this with people. And when I am analyzing a case, what I want to do is sort of identify which people are most important to these issues, because people are key evidence. People are witnesses who are going to come into trial. We can use them to explain stories, to offer alternative explanations, to negotiate, to act as character witnesses. And so the main part of what I'm going to start with here today is a deep dive into each individual person. If you want to skip over the people, we're going to go ahead and update the description in our video links, and we'll timestamp it so you can just skip over the people. If you just watch the series and you're familiar with who they are and how they're involved in all of this, you can skip forward. But I would encourage you to sit through the different people, because there's a lot here. There's a lot that the documentary goes through very quickly. We're going to spend a little time on it. So let's start first and foremost with of course, Joe Exotic. Joe Exotic, Joe Schreib-Vogel. Joe Exotic is the former owner of the Gerald Wayne Zoo, and he is somebody who is, of course, the main topic of this video, somebody who is accused of murder for hire. It's a very serious crime because this happened across state lines. They made it a federal case. And, he's got a lot of really interesting things to talk about. When I was recording this, I just took notes, and I have more pages on Joe than I think on anybody. But for all intents and purposes, we just want to cover the people basically. Okay, so Joe, he actually started out as an animal rights activist. And throughout the series, really episodes 1 through 5, we see him making threats and threats and threats and threats against Carole Baskin. So we're going to dive into what that means and why, but let's just put a pin in that. Joe Exotic. Next, we have kind of Joe's right-hand man, who's Eric Coey. Now, Eric Coey was the head keeper at the GW Zoo, and he actually found the job on Craigslist. He was responsible for the tiger shows, and then interestingly enough, he actually does testify against Joe. So at the very end, I think it was episode 7, Eric comes out and testifies against him. He's really kind of disturbed about the whole thing. He's very sort of in a world of hurt. I think he feels bad about what he's doing, but he has to go do it because it's his legal obligation. So he goes in and he testifies against Joe related to the tiger euthanasia parts of the claim, which we are going to get to. But other than that, he doesn't really help Joe a whole lot in terms of his testimony. I think he goes in and supports the government's claim that he actually did, kill the tigers at least. We also have another interesting character who's introduced early, and I call these people characters because it's a series, it's a show. They really are kind of developed as characters in this documentary series. The reason I call them characters is because they're not so much, we're not seeing the full picture of every single person. The interviews are spliced up. We have interviews from different time periods. Some are early, some are late. And so what the series creators are doing is they are turning these people into characters, whether they know it or not, because we're not getting the full picture of them. So they're sort of crafted in order to make the documentary compelling, to make it fun, to make it entertaining, to leave you with cliffhangers at the end of every episode. So I will refer to them as characters, knowing full well that they're not, they're people. But in this, the next character is John Reinke. John Reinke is a manager of the GW Zoo, 14-year employee. He lost his legs in a zipline accident and wasn't actually even a tiger accident like many people think. He was never called to testify. Never called to testify during Joe Exotic's trial, which is surprising given his sort of tenure alongside Joe. Now, he also is kind of a funny guy. Said he hadn't worn pants in 20 years. I thought that was just sort of humorous. He is really involved in the series. We see him a lot. He's in multiple different episodes. He's got a lot of opinions. We see a lot of him after the fact, after the trial. And so he's a pretty big player, John Reinke. Now, it's also important to note that he's a big player because he's not. He actually wasn't called to testify, which is sort of a problem, and we're going to get there. The next person that we're introduced to is Rick Kirkham. Rick Kirkham is the producer. He's been working with Joe on the reality show, and all of his work was destroyed in that fire. So there was an arson, or there was a fire that happened, some allegations that it was arson, but nothing was ever proved. Rick Kirkham's not super relevant, so we'll kind of just fly through him. We move on next to, of course, a big one. Big Carole Baskin, formerly Carole Lewis, and formerly Carol Murdoch, I believe. So Baskin is her third last name. She is on her third husband. Now, she is, of course, the owner and operator of Big Cat Rescue. She got a very, very long-running feud with Joe. Used to be Carole Lewis. Husband Don disappeared. And, of course, she does come in and testify against Joe. Now, the second issue, the Don Lewis issue, whether Carole actually murdered Don and fed him to tigers and what that investigation looked like, probably not going to get to that today because we just have too much to get through here on this one issue. Next, and so we're going to spend a lot of time with Carole. Next we've got actual Howard Baskin. So Howard Baskin is Carole Lewis's husband. He is also part of Big Cat Rescue, and he thinks he's in just a war with Joe Exotic. We've got Joe's husband, who I think was his, Joe's second or first, or he's one of the three husbands, and I think he was the first one in the show. His name is Joe Finley, and Joe Finley actually met Joe out of high school. So we kind of see this trend going on a lot throughout the series, as Joe really picks on these really young men, really. And Doc Antler does the same thing with women, but they get these people when they're very young. They bring them sort of into their ecosphere, and they keep them captive ever, from that point forward. So Joe Finley is Joe's husband, met Joe right out of high school, not really gay. And at the end of the series, he does come in and he testifies against Joe, which is, sort of a kind of a surprising thing, in my opinion, to have kind of your former spouse come in and testify you. There's a lot of sort of coercion and duress that goes on, so we'll talk about some of that. We've got Dr. Bhagavan Antal, who is the purveyor of Myrtle Beach Safari. He met Joe out of high school, also has multiple wives. He is the master of the universe, and he has a doctorate in mystical science. And then we learn at the very end of the series, that's a typo there, but his zoo was raided in December 2019. So actually not 2010, but 2019 is when he had his place raided. And so you can see the federal government is just being, continually aggressive. They took Joe down. They're going to go after Doc and probably all the other ones. But Doc is not, again, super relevant to this main issue, but because he has a lot of commentary about it, I included him here. We've got another person who works for Carole. Her name is Susan Bass. Works for Carole, hired by Carole to follow Joe. She works in sort of public relations, and then her goal is to stop Joe at the mall. So if you remember in the series, there was a lot of sort of talk about Joe taking the animals to malls and using them to generate money, and so she followed him around for a while there. Another person who is sort of prominent throughout the series is Kelsey Safrey, and if you don't remember, this was the woman who actually had her arm bitten off by a tiger, which was, obviously very traumatic. So Kelsey Safrey, she is the animal keeper at the GW Zoo, public relations, arm bitten off by a tiger. She does not testify against Joe in the series, and I thought that was pretty important. And she also doesn't believe that he did it. She says, she has some commentary throughout saying that, Joe definitely wanted her dead and said it a lot, but he's just not capable of actually doing that. And so we're going to talk through a little bit more about what that means when we get to the legal analysis of this video. Next, we have Sheriff Rhodes. So if you don't remember Sheriff Rhodes was the was one of the local law enforcement people from Garvin County, Oklahoma, over 8 years of experience as a sheriff. And he says Joe keeps him up at night, and he's pretty sort of concerned about what he sees going on at Joe's Zoo, something that keeps him up. He's got a lot of anxiety about it. And he also notes in the series that the arson was definitely man-made, but apparently they just didn't have enough evidence to tie it all together, to tie it to one person or another. We also see in the series somebody from PETA, from the animal rights activists, which of course makes sense, and her name is Brittany Peet. So Brittany Peet, which is very close to PETA, works for PETA. She's a captive animal law enforcement, and she admits to targeting Joe for many years. And then after the trial, she works with Joe. So we see her actually go into the jails. She's gathering a lot of information about how all this stuff works. Where are these animals coming from? What's happening to them? Who's doing what and where and when? And so she's in the series, but not, again, highly relevant. But we are including her for the sake of comprehensiveness. Now, next, we've got Joe's personal security guard, who is Mark Thompson. Mark Thompson is security guard, acknowledges that there's been many, many threats against Joe. He has some pretty sort of kind of damning testimony throughout the series where he says Joe was asking him a number of different times whether or not he could take care of Carole. And he's pretty serious about it. He doesn't... Unlike John and unlike Saf, he's not somebody who sort of interprets it in a joking manner. He does actually, when he's talking to the camera, say, he asked me to do it and I told him no. And it's a much more of a serious type of a conversation that was taking place when he was being interviewed. So not good testimony for Joe Exotic. We also have Tim Stark. Tim Stark is the purveyor of Wildlife in Need. He told Joe to back off Carole. He also partners with partners with Jeff Lowe, who we're going to get to here shortly. The partnership ultimately resolves, but he does say that there is a responsibility to stand up to bullshit laws, and I can concur with him on that one. We go over to Barbara Fisher. Barbara Fisher actually worked with Doc. She was Doc's apprentice from 1999 to 2009, formerly named Bala. She was paid $100 a week, and also got implants when she worked for Doc. She says Doc's operation was similar to a cult, and women reach enlightenment by sleeping with him. So not real relevant, but again, for the sake of comprehensiveness, we're going to go through some of these quickly. We've got Cody Antle. Cody Antle is Doc's son, doesn't do much other than explain his father's mystical ties in the series. We have a very tragic sort of situation with Travis Maldonado. Travis Maldonado was Joe's second husband. This was a very sad situation where he was married extremely young. Again, we talked about this with Joe Finley. January 18th, 2014, at age 19. So very young. Joe is 39 years older than he is. He gets married with Joe and John Finley in a three-way marriage in Oklahoma, and it's just totally normal. I don't know what the laws are specifically surrounding that in Oklahoma or how that works specifically, but we learn in the series that Travis is not even actually gay. He's not a homosexual. He sleeps with park women, and he dies tragically. He dies by accidentally shooting himself in the head. So he's with Joe's campaign manager, I believe that's who it was, and he's playing around with a gun, says it's not loaded, and he actually shoots himself. So very tragic, and of course Joe dealt with it the way only Joe Exotic can deal with things. So that was a sad state. We also are going to hear from his mother shortly. I'm going to get to her quickly. Next, we have Sylvia Corkle. Sylvia Corkle is great. She's in the news for News 9 News, and she has a lot of commentary throughout the entire series. She says Jeff Lowe was not called to testify, which is kind of bizarre. I agree with her on that. We're going to get there. She says it was probably strategic to combine animal abuse and murder for hire charges, which, again, I agree with that. And I'm going to cover that in depth when we get there. She agrees Jeff Lowe is a very skilled con man and not a trustworthy witness. So we see a lot from Sylvia. She does, I think, a great job of bringing some good commentary to the series. So we appreciate her reporting and everything that she's done. She's done a really good job there. Next, we have Chelsea Putman. Chelsea Putman is Joe's niece. He explains a lot of what's going on between the different property transfers, says Joe drained the mother of the GoFundMe assets. Not a huge character in the show. We've got Jeff Johnson, who is a former reptile dealer, says Carol's lawyers are vicious. They sue everybody. We get over to Joe's mother. We've got Shirley Schreibvogel. She is sued by Carole Baskin. So Carole Baskin is just going after everybody. She filed bankruptcy. And then, of course, Joe, and the way that Joe does is he starts a GoFundMe, or somebody starts a GoFundMe. And then from the series, they say that he basically took everything, took all of that money and repurposed it for whatever he was doing with it. Now we get to another big one. We've got Jeff Lowe. Jeff Lowe is critical, highly relevant to everything that we're talking about here on this issue. He is an investor con artist. He's got a felony criminal record. He's involved in a murder for hire plot. I think we have some pretty strong evidence that he was a key part of all of that. He's got a very long relationship with Alan Glover, and he assisted the feds against Joe. Interestingly, he was not called to testify from what I can gather. So neither the prosecution nor the defense called him. Why didn't he come in and testify? It's a good question. I don't know. I've had some discussions with some people about it, and so we'll sort of lay out some thoughts when we get there. We go to Jeff's wife, who is Lauren Lowe. Lauren Lowe is his wife. She's a swinger with him. They like sex with other women. She's pregnant with Jeff. And then, of course, at the end, Jeff tells her that he wants her to get back into the gym. So she's got to lose that baby weight, according to Jeff, which is sort of a interesting thing to tell your wife right after she had your child. But that's what we're dealing with in the Tiger Kingdom. Next up, we've got Diana Mazak. She's an employee at GW Zoo. She says that Jeff Lowe put tigers in suitcases and took them to Vegas. She also says that Jeff Lowe stole the zoo, which is sort of a sub-issue, whether or not Jeff actually did steal the zoo and what rights that gave him. I don't think there's anything there that's going to impact our analysis, so we're not going to get there today. Next, we've got Alan Glover. Big part of our analysis. So Alan Glover is an employee and handyman for Jeff Lowe. He worked at the GW Zoo, and I put AJE, which is sort of after Joe Exotic. So he was there while Joe Exotic was there, and he stayed there after the fact. So this guy is very involved, very connected to Jeff Lowe. He's got many disputes with Joe. We see this over the entire series. Joe Exotic asks Alan to do something, and Alan just says, no, I don't work for you. I work for Jeff. And Joe's got to go and talk to Jeff about it, and then Jeff will come straighten things out. So Alan Glover is, anti-Joe as far as I can tell. He's very pro Jeff Lowe, and he sort of, does whatever he asks him to do. When the trial takes place, he does testify, and he testifies very specifically that he went to Florida to kill Carole. Okay, I want to put a pin in that. So when we go through the trial part of the show, we see Howard Baskin sitting there with Carole, and they're talking about the trial. Howard says that Alan testified in trial that he actually went to Florida, physically left Oklahoma and went over to Florida. Then we've got some contradictory evidence, which we'll get to, that shows that didn't really happen. So it sounds to me like he perjured himself in the middle of the trial, and the court didn't actually call him out on that. The defense didn't raise it. Prosecution, of course, didn't raise it. No judge notified it. So he may have actually lied on the stand if we are kind of piecing this together correctly, and I believe that we are. So he probably perjured himself right in the middle of trial. We're going to spend a lot of time here talking about Alan. I actually wanted to take a quick moment and point out something that I noticed that I don't know if other people have noticed this. When we're talking about relevant evidence, we also need to talk about reliable evidence. So it may be relevant, but is it reliable? If it answers the question of who stole the cookie out of the cookie jar, that's a great question to answer, but is the answer correct? Is it reliable? As we're going through the series, I noticed sort of some interesting ways that the producers or the directors or the people who were making the series were communicating with these people. And I wanted to show you, I'm not sure if anybody else has noticed this because I haven't looked around, but this did stand out to me. So when they're doing interviews with Alan and with Eric and with some other people, they're in a weird environment. They're in a weird situation. So here I took a screenshot of an interview with Alan towards the end, and you can see here what is going on. So Alan is sort of in a bathtub, and he's washing himself with a bandana on, and he's sort of partially clothed down here, and he's got this drink here, and I'm not real sure what that drink is doing there. What's in that drink? When you actually watch the series, he looks sort of drunk in this series. So his eyes are sort of glazed over. He's kind of mumbling his words a bit. I hate to be a part of this shit, and he's just kind of upset. And so I started, who's taking a bath with your shorts on, with a bandana on, in the middle of a day with a koozie drink, with a really nice thick drink over there, while you're on camera having an interview for a Netflix series, a Netflix documentary. So I don't really know what was going on there. Was he drunk? Was he not? That may just be a one-off thing. But then I started kind of analyzing some of these other scenes where there's some bizarre stuff going on. This one happens with Eric Coe. So Eric now is being interviewed, and he is just having a bizarre conversation. So he's looking really close into the camera, and he's sort of kind of muttering some just weird phrases, and he's not making a whole lot of sense. And when you look close, we've got this vodka bottle. Looks like vodka to me back there. He's also got a wheelchair over here. We've got a little Budweiser going on in the background over here. He's smoking. And so, it just seemed like he was not in a good state. And so I had a little concern that maybe the actual filmmakers were sort of exploiting these people. They get them drunk, they get them intoxicated off something. There's a lot of drug use throughout the entire series, and now they're going to be asking them questions when they're inebriated or under the influence of something. So maybe they're hoping to get some tidbits out. They're trying to extract some information out of somebody, but these people are obviously are in my opinion under the influence. I don't know whether they actually are drunk or not. They sound like it, they look like it. Just kind of a weird thing to include in the documentary series. Not sure how intentional that was. We've also got some sort of undercover video footage going on. So we go back here when we're talking about James Garretson, and they don't, throughout the entire series, they're interviewing this guy face to face. It's a one-on-one conversation. So they're talking to him point blank. Then near the end of it, they go into his shop, and you can hear some of the producers or the filmmakers talking about whether or not, the camera is recording. So Now they're recording undercover. So what changed? Why were they so open with their camera and recording at the beginning of the series? James Garretson is in multiple interviews. We see him multiple change of clothes, multiple different settings. He's super willing to talk to them about whatever they want. Even says, don't tell Joe's defense attorney. Like, he's got information that's going to exonerate him. So he's very, very open book about all of this, which is why I'm a little bit, curious. Why was this whole scene shot undercover? Why didn't they just ask him to turn the camera on? And you'll notice here, this is a pretty good point here. This guy went down there to effing murder a lady, is what he says. And why is Alan not in custody? Why is he not in probation? So we're going to get to that as well. While we're on Mr. Garretson, let's talk about him. James Garretson, he's a businessman. Put that in quotes. He's got strip clubs and some other things. He does have a criminal record that we've gathered. He does testify in trial. We don't know specifically what he testifies about. He was a confidential informant for the feds, and he says very clearly that Jeff Lowe would not have been indicted, or would have been indicted, if it were not for him. So if you remember, there's a part of the series where James and Jeff are sort of working together, sort of in collusion, and then James actually tells him, hey, by the way, I'm working for the feds. And Jeff goes, oh, I want to help. And that relationship is what sort of saves Jeff Lowe instead of Joe Exotic. It is sort of how James makes it appear. We also have Joe's campaign manager, Joshua Dial. Joshua Dial is one of my favorite people in the series. He's Joe campaign's manager, and he says early on that as his campaign manager, it was the worst experience of my life. And he says that to the camera. And the way he does it, I have a lot of empathy for him. I'm not laughing at his situation, but he's just got a way of communicating that is kind of funny in context, because we can all kind of put ourselves there. It probably would be the worst experience of your life to be Joe Exotic's campaign manager. He is a libertarian, which big kudos and thumbs up on that. Feds approached him and they really sort of pushed him. You're either on Team Joe or you're on the team government, and one of us is going to win, and I think we know who it is. So Joshua explains that. Now, he doesn't actually talk much about where he ended up in that sort of equation, but he does explain that he did receive that threat. He also says that when he received that threat, it was the scariest moment of my life. So Joshua Dial has both the worst experience of his life and the scariest experience of his life as a result of his connection to Joe Exotic. So hope he's doing well. Hope he's recovering well. Maybe one day we'll cross paths at some convention or something. Next, we've got Cheryl Maldonado. So we already talked about her son, Travis. Travis was killed himself accidentally, and we see Joe go to the funeral. Joe actually doesn't testify, but he speaks at the funeral and kind of makes it all about himself. He kind of is talking about how close they were and how whatever. So, his mom is not happy about that. We also have Dylan Passage. Dylan is Joe's fourth husband, if my count is correct. And he married Joe 2 months after Travis died. So Travis died by the gunshot wound. And then a couple months later, Dylan is there with Joe and they're getting married. Eventually, he actually terminates the relationship. So at the end of the series, after the trial, we see he's on the phone with Joe. Joe had been calling him a number of different times, being concerned he was going to leave him and all of this stuff. We got some really, really significant codependency issues with Joe Exotic, and actually a lot of people in the show. But he is really concerned that Dylan's going to leave him, and then Dylan finally does. Once Joe gets convicted and we realize that he's not getting out, Dylan then says, I can't do this anymore. And from that, I took it to mean as that relationship was over. We also have Marcia David. Marcia David was an employee at the GW Zoo, helped Joe move cats and animals out of the zoo during the falling out with Jeff. Not hugely relevant, but somebody I wanted to cover. And then finally, of course, we're going to get to Amanda Green, the prosecutor. So Amanda Green is the prosecutor. So just for people who are not aware, when you're charged with a crime, the person who's charged with the crime is called the defendant. They are the defense. The government has to prosecute that crime. It goes to a judge. All of that is taking place in front of a judge to make sure that everything's working fairly and properly. So for our purposes, Amanda Green is a federal prosecutor, and she says in the series that the government contacted Carole in November of 2017, sort of as this whole plot was unfolding. She keeps calling it a plot, says it's coming together. They bring in a confidential informant, and she admits that Joe did not commit any overt act with a confidential informant. So if you don't know what overt act means, I'm going to get there. But basically, she has a statement in the series that Joe did not give the confidential informant any money, any phones, nothing. We have no evidence that he gave them anything. Okay, so Joe doesn't do that with the CI. She agrees that the plot was over. And then, boom, suddenly, as soon as James Garretson is having a conversation with Jeff Lowe, they learn that there was no overt act. So Jeff Lowe and Alan Glover, they say, well, there's no overt act. Wait a minute. All you need is some money. So then they say, oh, no. Actually, Joe Exotic did give Alan Glover $3,000. Boom, there's your overt act. And the prosecutor just snatched that right up and then files the indictment. Files it right after Alan Glover says that he received the $3,000. So they go back to Alan, the feds do, and they interview him a multiple number of times. And he says that his story is sort of the same. They file the indictment. Joe flees, and then he gets arrested. So she is kind of hanging her hat on that transfer of money, that overt act. And we're going to get to a lot more of the legal technicalities here shortly. One quick note on Amanda Green. So as the viewers know, the regulars of the channel know, I am a criminal defense attorney. So it's our job to kind of, beat up on prosecutors a little bit. I know many of them are, amazing people. Some of them not so much. But Amanda Green, I wanted to point out just a quick little practice tip while we're here. Amanda Green, as we're watching the series, you've been noticing I've been gulping. My throat is parched. But Amanda Green is in the middle of this interview, and as she is communicating, she says what we call in the defense world a bad fact. In the legal world, it's a bad fact. So these are facts that just don't help your case, and every case has them. If you get pulled over for a DUI and you don't have any alcohol in your blood, that's a really bad fact for the government. Okay, it happens a lot. People get arrested all the time and they're not impaired. But it's a bad fact, and so they have to address that. When Amanda Green is talking through this, and she says specifically that Joe Exotic did not give the confidential informant anything, no phones, no money, nothing, she has a big gulp. She takes a big gulp right after that. So I wanted to just play it. I clipped it. Let's take a quick look. We'll just leave that sit there for just a quick minute. Just so that we can make that point, right? It's important. If you've got a sort of body language tell, if you're sitting there in court or if you're meeting with an attorney or something and you hear a bad fact, you may be able to tell it was a bad fact because of that person's body language. So she very clearly thinks it's a bad fact. Joe did not actually give the CI anything. Joe did not actually give him any money. So you can see that. So I just want to point that out because that's just something that I like to do. Okay, so we've got a lot of the characters taken care of. We know who's in the show and who's relevant and whatnot. Now let's talk about location. So where was all of this stuff happening? We've got a large part of it is in the GW Zoo in Wynnewood, Oklahoma, which apparently GW also maybe stands for Greater Wynnewood. We've also got Myrtle Beach Safari, which is over in South Carolina. And then we've got the Big Cat Rescue happening down in Tampa. So we've got Joe Exotic's crew, we've got Carole Baskin's crew, and then we've got Doc Antler. And there's some other kind of smaller zoos that are scattered around throughout the country in the Southwest. So now we've got some pretty good context. So we know who the people were, we know who the players are, we know what the really big issue is. Now we want to dive into some criminal law. We heard a lot about what's called an overt act. Okay, Jeff Lowe says this as well. In one of his interviews, he's actually communicating with the interviewer and says something like, they needed an overt act. They needed that. So he knew what this was and he knew what we were talking about. Overt act can mean really one of two things in criminal law. It can mean, the phrase overt act can apply to conspiracy. In this context, they may have been talking about it as what's called an actus reus. There's a lot of different things. So let me just show you in general how criminal law works. Okay, this is something we learned the first semester, probably the first week of criminal law in law school. We talk about the difference between a mental state and a physical act. Okay, one's called a mens rea, which is your mental state. The other one is called an actus reus. So this means a physical activity. So here's what it looks like. When you're talking about mens rea, what that means is guilty mind. Actus reus means guilty act. So here's how that works. Let's say, for example, you're in a grocery store and you say, I want that candy bar. That's in your mind. You've got a mental state and you say, I'm going to take it. I'm not going to pay for it. I want that candy bar. You now have a guilty mind. But that alone by itself is not enough. People have guilty minds all the time, all day long. People think thoughts that they never act on. So that by itself, just having a guilty mind, just having the mens rea part of this is not enough. We also need an act. We need actus reus. We need some physical action, something taking place. So in this situation, it's placing the candy bar in your pocket. You've got the guilty mind because you wanted it, and now you commit the act of actually taking it and putting it in your pocket. That is what equals criminal liability. So just the same way, okay, for many types of offenses, just an act alone is not enough. There are some crimes called strict liability crimes, and your mental state doesn't matter. But for most different types of offenses, you've got to have an act and the mental state. Make sense? Okay, so let's talk about Joe now. So now we go back to Joe. What was Joe's mental state, right? Joe very, very clearly had a guilty mind. No question about it. He wanted Carole dead and burned and gone and just, decimated from the planet. But that alone is not enough. We see many different examples throughout the entire series of him shooting her dummies, shooting her face, pictures of her face, and just really being sort of abusive to her. So now the question is, well, what was the act? What was the act? What did he do to actually commit that crime? What action did he take? So we're going to dive into that. Now, an overt act. There are some legal definitions and that I want to cover. I don't know that they were necessarily covered in the show, in this way. But here's the definition from West Encyclopedia of American Law. It's an open, manifest act from which criminality may be implied, an outward act done in pursuance and manifestation of an intent or design. So, super difficult language, really kind of boring and difficult to interpret. But basically what it's saying is that it needs to be something. It needs to be open. It needs to be manifest. It needs to be an outward act. It needs to be done in pursuance with the manifestation of intent or design, meaning you intended to do that. You saw that candy bar, you wanted it, you had the guilty mind, you knew you were going to take it without paying for it, and then you took it. They were in conjunction with one another. They were connected. They were tied together. So what was the overt act in Joe's case? Okay, this is more than just words typically. There's an example that we use in law school. You've got 5 guys who are sitting around and they're talking about robbing a bank. Okay, I've probably done that, quite frankly. Not intentionally to go rob a bank, but just talking about it. Wouldn't it be nice if we just went and knocked off that bank or whatever? People talk like that. And so is that alone enough to be a crime? No, the answer is no, it's not. So now let's say one of those 5 guys actually goes down to the sporting goods store and, after they've been speaking with each other, they say, yep, you know what we're going to need? We're going to need guns. We're going to need face masks. We're going to need, all of these other equipment. We're going to need a driver, blah, blah, blah. Then one guy goes out and buys 5 face masks, ski masks. And he comes back to their facility. The cops are there. They say, hey, you're all under arrest for conspiracy. You're going to rob a bank and all that. That overt act is probably enough to sort of incriminate all of those different people. So it's just a very easy example, but you can see it's something that is tied to the original plan. Now, there's a lot of different rules on conspiracy. Could those 4 other guys bow out of that conspiracy? Yes. How do they do it? Depends. So there's a lot that goes into it, but the overt act is going and getting the ski mask. So what was the overt act in Joe's case? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about a really important part of the entire series that gets glossed over, and it is the confrontation call. Okay, we have in this series what's called a confrontation call. Confrontation call is kind of what it sounds like. You have one person call another person and confront them, get evidence out of them. And the person who's on the receiving end of the phone call, in this case, Alan Glover, doesn't know that he's being recorded. So I put here the logo of the FBI. Pretty sure they were the ones who were involved in this. So they're on the phone call with Jeff Lowe. They both call over to him. Alan Glover answers the phone, probably has no idea that the FBI is on the call, and Jeff is sort of coaching him through the conversation. So here's what that looks like. Now, in the series, they split this up. They split this up between two different, I think it was 2 different episodes, 2 different times. You only get part of the material first, and then as the show continues to go on, they slowly start dripping you some more information. So what I did is I took everything that we saw from this confrontation call, which I'm presuming is just one call, we put it together, and I've got a transcript. So I want to read through it. I don't want to play the clip. I could play the clips because I don't know what the copyright rules are on YouTube. It's not even worth it. So I just have the transcript, and I want to just show you what it says. We have Jeff, who says, they know all about Joe, right? What I recommend strongly, you do not want to be on Joe's side when this comes down. You want to be on the government side. I gotcha. What that means is you've got to tell me, like, when I don't want to put any words in your mouth. So, like, let's just say from the very first time he approached you, what he said, and I'll let you go. Alan says, he would ask me, hey, bro, you know anybody going to kill that woman for me? What did he offer in exchange is what he says. So Jeff is just going, okay, let's get right to the nuts and bolts. We need an offer. We need an exchange. We need an overt act. And so Jeff just throws that out there. What was the exchange? What was the overt act? And Alan comes back and says, well, he was supposed to give me $5,000 cash to leave with. But it's your understanding, Jeff fires right back. When you listen to it, it's right back. But it's your understanding when he gave you that money, he did it for the purpose of going down to Tampa to kill Carole Baskin, right? It sounds like coaching to me. For the purpose of going down to kill Carole Baskin, right? He couldn't have let Alan just make that determination on his own. Alan says, yeah, he gave me the $3,000, supposed to get 5, but he only got 3. But that was about the effing money. It was about effing him over. And I think the series kind of just stops right there, and they just leave it there. They say, okay, so maybe there's a hint that Alan really wasn't going to do it, or he wasn't going to, actually go to Florida. He wasn't going to kill Carole. He didn't even get the full amount. He got 3 instead of 5. So the full transaction was not even completed. And, it's kind of like, going to, to buy anything, right? If you went to your local Walgreens, we go back to the candy bar and you say, hey, I want to buy that candy bar, but I'm only going to give you half of the cost for it. Or I'll give you 60% of what it costs. Are they going to let you walk out of the door with the candy bar? No, the transaction is not complete. So we get a little hint of that. But then later on in the series, we actually see sort of the last part, the conclusion here, which is, remember, this is about getting Joe in trouble, even locked up for what he did. Jeff says this. Alan says, they would have to effing promise me not to effing lock me up for that. Jeff says, right, well, they're going to do the same thing with me. Before they meet with me and make sure that what I have to tell them is good enough for a conviction, once that happens, then they say, okay, well, here's your deal. Here's what we'll do for that. And they'll have to do the same thing with you. So he's basically establishing that there's a quid pro quo going on here. You give them the evidence that they need to go convict Joe. He says it very clearly. Remember, this is about getting Joe in trouble. If you give them that information, they're going to give you a deal just like they're giving me a deal. Even though Alan was the guy who was going to drive down and literally murder her, according to the government. They believe he was capable of it. They believe he was going to do it. They believe he was already in Florida, according to his own testimony. So here's your deal, is what they're talking about. You rat Joe out. We're going to rat out. We're going to take care of the other end of this. We go back over to Alan. Alan says, I didn't go to Tampa. What would I want to go there for? I wasn't going to kill no MFing buddy. He could have given me $1 million effing dollars and I wouldn't have went and killed that effing woman for nothing. I wouldn't have even went to effing Florida on a vacation. So the testimony here is very different, right? The conversation that Jeff is having with Alan doesn't match up to the testimony that apparently took place in the trial, where Alan says that he actually did go to Florida. And presumably his other testimony was, yeah, he was going to kill her. I love Florida. I go down there all the time. I was just going to swing by and just whack Carole Baskin, and not even a big deal. Not even anything worth talking about any further. So basically the confrontation call directly goes against the testimony in the trial, which is a big deal. So now let's back up over to Joe's trial. When we're talking about a trial, we can really break it up in about 3 different phases. You have a pre-trial phase, you have a trial, and then you have an appeal process. So right now, Joe is in the appeal process. My understanding is that he's lost his trial. We saw that in the documentary, but now he is appealing it, and we're going to see where that goes. But there were some interesting things that happened in the pre-trial phase. So this is what I want to spend some time on. When you're going through a criminal case, it's important that the pre-trial portion of it is dealt with. It's handled appropriately, because that can win your trial. It can avoid you actually having to go to trial, because you can get a lot of this stuff negotiated out sooner than that. So we're going to talk about some pre-trial proceedings that happen, or some issues that maybe should have happened in here that would have given Joe a better shot, or would have kind of shed some light, really. I'm not trying to advocate for Joe, but we would certainly like him to have had a more of a fair trial. There were some pretty big problems that we've identified. So let's take a look at the first one. Is an issue called severance. Okay, this came up in the actual show where I believe it was the Channel 9, the news reporter, who said it was almost strategic as to what they did by combining the animal charges with the murder for hire charges. There is a rule about that. So it's in the federal rules. It's basically called severance. And here's what it looks like. It's relief from a prejudicial joinder. Okay, now this is the Rule 14 Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. I am going to have some slides here that have a lot of law on them, some case law, not case law, statutory law, rules of evidence, rules of criminal procedure. And it's not really my intent that you read through it all. I'm going to highlight what it means. But if you're a legal, if you're somebody who wants to dive into this a little bit further, or you're an actual lawyer, this is where the rules came from. This is where I pulled them from. Okay, so they exist. But my point is that in Joe's case, there's what's called relief from prejudicial joinder. His case was in federal court, and presumably this should have come up. But here's what the rule says. If it appears that there's going to be prejudice to a defendant, the court may order separate trials of the separate counts. Okay, so I've got a diagram. I want to show you what that looks like, but that's the rule, right? If there's going to be prejudice, if combining the charges is going to make the trial unfair or difficult, or we're not going to come to a conclusion, the court may actually separate those out, which is what I think should have happened here, but which I do not believe did. I don't even know if it was asked for, but here's what it looks like. All right, so on the one side, on the left, you can see how this works. You've got the murder for hire charges, you've got the Tiger murder criminal charges, and those have been combined, and they're going down to a jury trial. On the other side, this is what it would look like if you split them up. So you'd have one murder for charge hire that goes to a jury, and you've got one Tiger murder charge that goes over to the jury trial. And so you have some separation here. Okay, these people in this jury trial on the murder for hire are not going to, or should not be anyways, influenced by these charges. So what we saw here from the reporter is that she says it does seem almost strategic, and I completely agree with her. I think it's entirely strategic to keep those two things together. Now, from the defense side, you would just say it's way overly prejudicial. The murder or the euthanasia of the Tigers was part of Joe's normal operation in business. It has no relevance at all to what he would do with Carole, to whether or not he would actually go so far as to hire a hitman and then wish her dead, pay for her to be killed. One thing has got nothing to do with the other, and the problem with bringing both charges together is that if the jury hears all of that, if they say, wait a minute, Joe is already doing murder for hire, and now he's also killing tigers, that's a pretty big deal, right? If you're combining those two things together, and they may say, well, the tiger charges are so gross, how could you possibly do this to animals? And then the government's going to parade all of these people in front of the courtroom, that it may actually impact them. They may say, man, this guy's just a piece of garbage, and so they're going to find him guilty on all charges. Whereas if you separate them out, the jury's going to be a little bit more focused. So they're not going to be thinking on the murder for hire charges in context of the tiger euthanasia. They're going to be focused on it uniformly by itself. So that's where sort of the issue comes in. So why wasn't this actually severed? We don't know. We don't know if they asked for it and the judge just denied it, or we don't know if they just didn't ask for it at all. The rule says that the court may allow it, but it may not. So that's what we're looking at. Somewhat related to joinder and severance is the idea that certain evidence, although it may answer some questions, it may actually do more harm than good. So this is a rule that we discuss a lot about in the rules of evidence, about whether or not evidence is really more probative than it is prejudicial. So is it going to answer more questions than it is going to hurt the case or not? And if the evidence is that it's actually going to do more harm than good, then the rules say we keep that out. We don't bring that into court because it's too damaging. It's not worthwhile. So there's a little bit of a balancing test that's going on. We need to decide whether or not information is useful or not. In the Tiger King, we definitely see some evidence that is very difficult. It's very hurtful to the case, but I'm not sure how much additional evidence that it brings into the story. So when we're talking about severance, when we're talking about whether we should split these things up, we want to know whether or not some of that evidence is actually going to do more harm than good. So when we go forward, we know that the trial went this way. We know they combined the two of these things. And then what the government did is they brought in a lot of people to sort of testify against Joe, to testify as to his character and explain a lot of what is going on here from their perspective. And so what I wanted to do is just touch briefly on the rule of probative versus prejudicial evidence. So here's what that looks like. It is Federal Rules of Evidence Rule 403, excluding relevant evidence for prejudice, confusion, waste of time, or other reasons. So here's what the rule says. The court may exclude relevant evidence if its probative value is substantially outweighed by a danger of one or more of the following. So unfair prejudice, confusing the issues, misleading the jury, wasting time, needlessly presenting cumulative evidence. If this is the case, meaning if the evidence is if it's more harmful than it is probative, then that evidence should be thrown out. It should not be allowed into court. And in my opinion, there was a lot of that was taking place. Basically, every single thing that Joe did with these animals and a lot of what Joe did in his past is very damning. Now, the government on the other side is going to come back and say, yeah, but it's all relevant and it's actually not harmful because it's necessary. Joe is somebody who, very clearly murders tigers. He euthanizes all sorts of different, endangered animals. And therefore, that's indicative of the fact that he is somebody who is okay with killing things. He's somebody who just likes to they're not useful to me anymore, so I'm going to eliminate them. So I'm going to guess that's what the government's argument was here, that they're going to say all of it should come in. Everything should come in. Every time he shot a dummy, every time he made one of those videos, excoriating Carole Baskin, all of that's relevant. It all shows his intent, and all of that intent is relevant to a murder for hire charge. All of that shows that he is very likely to do that. So that's their argument. From the defense perspective, I don't even know if they made these claims, if they objected to that, if they tried to keep some of that evidence out, how many motions, pretrial motions did they file, motions limine or any of these other motions to keep these things out. We just don't know because the series doesn't give us a lot on that. So if they did try to keep a lot of that out, which I would presume they would, then kudos to them for doing that. But if not, then that may be a pretty big, major problem. The next rule that I wanted to talk about is the impeachment of witnesses for prior convictions. So if we remember, Alan Glover, James Garretson, Jeff Lowe, all of these people, I think including Joe Exotic, they've all got prior records. They've got criminal histories. Some of them are longer than others. Jeff is sort of known globally as a con artist. So there are rules about that. So the Channel 9 news reporter, she also said something to this effect, that they brought Alan Glover onto the stand in the middle of the trial and they asked him a bunch of questions and they just took it at face value. They said, and he swore, yes, I promise to tell the truth. He did that, and then his testimony was used to basically indict Joe Exotic. So is it reliable? Is it good? Is it good material? Well, here's what the rule says about that. It says that you can actually attack a witness's character for truthfulness by evidence of a criminal conviction. So this comes from the Federal Rules of Evidence 609, and you can see here that's what it says. Attacking a witness character for truthfulness by evidence of a criminal conviction. There are some rules about it. You need to be in prison for more than 1 year. It needs to be admitted subject to 403. So there are these other different rules in there, but the general rule for our purposes is that you can attack a person's prior criminal record. And so did that happen with Alan Glover? Did we impeach his character for truthfulness based on his prior criminal convictions? We don't know necessarily what his prior record looks like, but I know it's not good. We heard in episode 5 that he went to prison at age 18, is what he said. He said that he's kind of been in and out his whole life. We have a mugshot. This is taken directly from the show, which shows that he looks a lot closer to that than he does at age 18. Typically, if you go to prison at age 18, it's for something very serious, like somebody is killed or close to being killed. They typically don't put you in prison for a first offense, drug offense at age 18 if you were using marijuana or some other drug offense or shoplifting or something. It's a bad crime. They want to help young people rehabilitate rather than punish. That's arguable, but that's the theory behind it. And so Alan, if he's in prison at age 18, he probably did something pretty serious. I didn't look it up. I don't know what it is, but it's not good. His mugshot here, as I said, is much more recent, and sort of everybody just kind of knows. This guy's he's bad news. He's been in and out of the system. He's somebody who kind of talks a big game. Yeah, I'll kill Karen. I'll cut her head off. What do you want me to use? Kind of has that demeanor about him. And so everybody in the series just globally considers him to be somebody who's capable of that, but he's also dishonest and just not a great character all around. Next, we have what's called a prior inconsistent statement. So, as I mentioned, we went through the confrontation call. Alan Glover testifies in the middle of trial that he went to Florida. He drove down there, no problem. That's confirmed by Howard Baskin, who was at the trial. Alan's confrontation call says entirely the opposite. I wouldn't go to Florida on vacation. I wouldn't go to Florida if he paid me $1 million. He's just not going there. Well, how do you deal with that? On the recorded phone call, he says one thing, but in trial, he says the other thing. Well, as defense attorneys, what we can do is we can impeach them. We can impeach a person with their prior inconsistent statements. There's a rule. It's called the Federal Rules of Evidence, Rule 613 for witnesses. It says that extrinsic evidence of a witness's prior inconsistent statement is admissible, but the witness needs the opportunity to explain or deny it. So in this situation, we can use extrinsic evidence. That's outside evidence, material that we have recorded somewhere else that we have saved. We can bring that into court and say, you didn't say that before, you liar. And that can really undermine a witness's credibility. If they're sitting in court saying, I did all of these different things, and we bring out a phone recording that shows the exact opposite, well, basically everything that comes out of that witness's mouth is now suspect. And that happened here in this series. We have a very clear prior inconsistent statement between Howard Baskin and Alan Glover. So Howard said that Alan testified that he made the trip to Florida and he believed him. And then Alan said, he didn't go to Florida. He would never go to Florida, not even on vacation, not ever. And so the question is, well, what happened in trial? Did Joe Exotic's attorneys know that? Did they know that this phone recording existed? Did they use it when Alan Glover took the stand? Did they blast him on that? Did they actually play the tape recording? This is a big reason that criminal defense attorneys do interviews with everybody. We interview everybody on recording, all the witnesses, all the police officers, all the bar owners, anybody who was involved in the situation. We want to record them so that we can impeach them if their story changes. So did Joe Exotic's attorneys do that? Did they have this phone recording? And if not, why not? And if they didn't have it, that's a pretty big problem. If they did have it and they didn't impeach him with it, that's also a big problem. Were their attorneys just not skilled enough to recognize that testimony in trial was untruthful and they didn't play it? Did the judge keep some of that out? Why was this call split between the two? The government listened to the call and said, yeah, oh, there it is. Gave Alan $3,000. That's the overt act. But what about all the rest of this about not going to Florida? Did the attorneys for Joe even ask about that? I don't know. We don't know. Maybe they did. Maybe they covered their bases and there's a very good explanation as to why he was not impeached with that. Maybe he was impeached with that. But the jury just said, nope, we believe we want to weigh the facts. The jury is the trier of facts. They get to decide who's credible and who's not credible. So the attorneys may have just said, we're going to impeach you on that prior statement. And then Alan may have just explained it. Well, I was on drugs. I didn't know anything about it, but I did intend to go to Florida, or I was there. And they just decided to believe him over his own prior statements, which is, kind of surprising if that was the case. But I would love to know more about that, actually, whether or not they did impeach him or not, or how that sort of concluded. Next, we have Joe's own testimony. So Traditionally, the general rule is the defendant does not testify at trial. You just don't do it. In most cases, we don't put our defendants on the stand unless they can provide some value, unless they can explain something that we can't otherwise explain. We know in the Constitution that you cannot be compelled under the Fifth Amendment in any criminal case to be a witness against yourself. And that's part of the problem with putting a defendant on the stand, is the prosecutor gets to ask them all sorts of questions. Did you do this? And they can really clarify it out, and they can beat them up pretty significantly. So the idea is that you just want to keep your defendant, your client, you off the stand in most situations. But there are times when you are needed to testify, when that's just not a good enough answer, because the jury wants an explanation. They want to know what the heck happened. And the only way you can do that is by putting the defendant on the stand. Couple issues here. Well, before I get there, let me explain why Joe needed to testify. So here's a couple quick things. We needed an alternative explanation. So no other witnesses could explain Joe's side of the story. The government presents their case. They say Joe wanted Carole dead, and he has made numerous threats, and he's made videos about it, and he shot dummies and all of these things. Also, he gave Alan Glover $3,000, and Alan went down to Florida to actually do it. Joe is the only person who can say, I didn't do any of that stuff, or I didn't at least do the $3,000. I had no intention of actually hiring him to go kill Carole. So he's the only person that can explain that. The attorneys should have been prepared for his testimony. Now, I don't know whether they were or not. We do hear from John Reinke that his attorneys told the courtroom that they opposed him testifying. They told Joe, we oppose you testifying. When Joe was going to get up and testify, they told the courtroom that they opposed Joe testifying. That's according to John Reinke. Now, I do not know whether or not the jury was in the room when that statement was made. If they were in the room and they heard Joe's own attorneys sort of undermine his credibility, if the attorneys told the jurors, we do not want Joe to testify, we are actually like begging him not to do it, and Joe does that anyways, then Joe looks reckless. He looks, sort of out of his mind. He looks like somebody who's listening to the advice of his own attorneys. And so the jury's just going to look at him and go, that guy's out of control. That guy doesn't know what's good for him. And so clearly he's capable of murdering Carole. It just really paints him in a bad light. Most of the time, those arguments happen outside of the presence of the jury. So at some point, the defense attorneys would say, Judge, we have an issue. Can we approach? They would approach. They'd listen to both sides. The defense would say, Judge, our client wants to testify. I want to make a record that I don't think this is a good thing to do. Judge would say, okay, cool. We're going to excuse the jury. Everybody goes out of the courtroom. The arguments are made. Bring the jury back in so they don't hear any of that stuff. And then Joe goes up and testifies. That may be what happened. I don't know. But John said that the attorneys told the entire courtroom. Now, John was not a witness. John did not testify as a witness. John may have just been as a member of the public, just in court, and they may not have asked the courtroom to leave. So maybe that's what John meant, but I don't know. If they did do that in the presence of the jury, I'd have a big problem with that, a really big problem with that. So we just don't know. I'm going to guess that these are professional people and they did the right thing and they did it outside of the presence of the jury, but we just don't know. So as Joe does testify, so as I said, typically no, but in this case, we need him to. When he does take the stand, he offers a pretty good explanation, in my opinion, and we've got some pretty good evidence for it also. So he actually testifies that Joe told Jeff that the man won't work for me. He won't work for me. And everything I asked him to do, he just says no. So Joe says, we need to do something about it. Jeff responds and says, you know what? You're right. Maybe it's better if we just send Alan off to South Carolina. We're going to give him $3,000. And why don't you just pull it out of the register and give it on over to him? We'll get him the heck out of here. Pretty decent explanation for the transfer of the $3,000, which the government and the prosecutor herself said that was really the impetus for the indictment. We have a text message from Jeff to Joe that explains that. Alan is probably better off in South Carolina for everybody. And, this was just a screen clipping from the series. Okay, well, maybe he'll be better off in South Carolina. So everybody's sort of going along the same way. Joe wants him gone. Jeff wants him gone. We're going to give him $3,000. Why don't you just take that $3,000, take it out of the till, and send it on over to Jeff, to Alan, and then Alan can get out of here. which is a pretty decent explanation in my mind. Now now we're down to a situation where it's a kind of a he said, she said type of a situation. So then you go back to the credibility, you go back to the relevance, you go back to all of the other issues, to joinder and all of those different things, and you say, who's more truthful? Is Joe Exotic more truthful than Alan Glover? It's what a jury's for. They're the ones who get to decide that. But we've got some pretty good evidence from Joe Exotic that Jeff said that Alan would be leaving. And we've got some pretty clear evidence that Alan lied on the stand. He said he never ever went to Florida, took the stand, said he went to Florida. We've got some indications that Jeff is really involved in this whole thing also, and he's never even called to testify. So there's a lot of problems that are going on here. But Joe's alternative explanation, in my mind, is pretty good. It's not bad. He says he did give him the $3,000, but there's a pretty good reason for that. So the jury deliberates. They don't take long. It's all over with pretty quickly. They come back. Joe is guilty. The judgment and the sentence, he's found guilty. I believe it was all charges, and he's sentenced to 22 years in prison. So, given his age, given his sort of condition, his mental health, and a lot of other things, it may be a death sentence for him. We just don't know. So that's all of the analysis there. We just went through a lot. We've been going for over an hour now. And the question is, well, did he actually do it? So here are some arguments that maybe he didn't get a fair shake. Number one is we want to talk about the ineffective assistance of counsel claims. Okay, there's a lot of material in here that I sort of was poking at because it may have been a very big problem. Conversely, it may have been no problem at all. This stuff may have been covered in the trial. The series was very short on sort of the analysis of the trial. It was 2 episodes, and really much of the trial was just sort of glossed over. So I'm not trying to claim that Joe's attorneys did a terrible job, but there are some pretty big things some pretty big gaps that the series just doesn't cover. Number one, Jeff Lowe was not called as a witness by the defense. He just wasn't called. So the prosecutor's office didn't call him. The defense didn't call him. And this guy is sort of right in the center of everything that's going on. James Garretson said he's a problem. He's directly connected to Alan Glover. There's text messages between Joe and Jeff indicating that there's an alternative explanation for the $3,000, and nobody wanted to call him. So I spoke with a couple people from my firm, and sort of mixed reactions on this. Some people said, well, I probably wouldn't have called Jeff either because he's such a loose cannon. He's such an unknown variable that we just don't want him there because he could just kind of add fuel to the fire. He could corroborate every single thing that Alan was saying and really just bury on top of Joe. My thought is, well, why didn't the prosecutor call him if that was the case? Why didn't they bring him in there? He was texting. He's the one who, was managing the zoo while all this was going on. He's a pretty relevant evidence. So why didn't they call him? Well, my guess is because the prosecutor knew he was a con artist and knew that he would be very, very impeachable on the stand and knew that the defense attorneys would have a field day cross-examining him, which is why they didn't call him. So from a defense perspective, any time that a prosecutor or the government doesn't call somebody who they probably should, it opens up a big red flag. It raises that right up tall because we want to know why not. If it's so relevant, if it's so important to the case, why is that person not being called? And then you want to investigate that further. So in my mind, Jeff Lowe should have been called as a witness, and neither side did that from what I gathered. John Reinke was also not called as a witness by the defense. So this was a pretty big deal. This was one person that I thought absolutely should have been called. We learned that Carole Baskin was sort of called in as a witness, and we've got, not as a witness to anything that happened, not as a witness to the euthanasia of the tigers, not as a witness to anything that happened behind the scenes of the murder for hire. She's really brought on as a character witness to just sort of lay out and talk about Joe's intent and Joe's motivation and Joe's kind of hatred and bias against her. She comes in and talks about all those things. Well, what if we brought some other people from Joe's side to come in and counteract all that? John Reinke says, he says in the show, we all wanted her dead, man. I've said it before. Everybody said it. Everybody was talking about that. The Carole Baskin, I'd love to see her dead one day. He admits that even he himself verbally has said it probably many times. There's a whole clip in the show from that. So you can just see that John would be a good witness to come in and provide some context to the whole situation. John doesn't necessarily, Joe doesn't necessarily want her actually murdered, but we've got these two factions that are building up. You've got the pro-animal rights activists. You've got Carole, who's claiming that she's doing all these amazing things for the animals. I have a chart that I've actually made. Basically, the way that she treats her animals is about equivalent to the way all of these other people treat their animals and their people who are managing the animals. Carole's arguably less of a good owner of a zoo than these other people, but that's for a separate video. But John could come in and explain the context. He could say, look, we've got this war brewing. We've got these animal rights people versus these zoo operator and owners, and nobody was actually going to murder anybody, but we do dislike each other. We're at each other's throats all the time. In large part, it's kind of good for business. The more that each one of these sides has an enemy to sort of point their guns at, that's a good thing for both of them. They can continue their war, and they can get a lot of popularity and credibility out of it, but nobody actually intended to murder her. So John could have been brought in to discuss a lot of that, and I think that would have provided some really helpful context. Alan Glover was also not impeached by his prior inconsistent statements. We've already talked about that. Alan testified that he did go to Florida. He was in court under oath, but he didn't. He tells Jeff in the confrontation call, I never went to Florida. I would never go to Florida. They're in Oklahoma. That's a number of states away. It's not a quick trip over to Florida. It's a big journey. So he's not going to go there. So his testimony is just completely at odds with one another and odds for reality. And was he impeached? We don't know. If they didn't impeach him on that, I think that's a big problem for those attorneys. Alan Glover was also not impeached by evidence of his prior criminal conviction. So as we saw, federal rules say that you can undermine a person's character for truthfulness by showing that they've got prior past convictions. There are some additional rules about that. But from what we've seen with Alan's mugshots, what we've seen with his admissions that he was in prison at the age of 18, a lot of that would have been relevant. It would have been good for the jury to know who they're listening to, and then they could judge his credibility based on their own determination. But we just don't know whether or not that actually happened. Another big problem in my mind was that the criminal charges were not severed, so they were allowed to pursue together. The criminal charges just went forward all together. So the jury heard all about Joe's, abuses of the tigers and the other exotic animals. We heard a lot about the prior history of Joe shooting dummies and, just blasting Carole's mannequins of her head and things like that. We heard a lot about that. But they just weren't separated from one another. So the jury then could listen to all of the tiger euthanasia claims and impute that all of that same activity, that same desire, that persona would also translate over to Carole, which is, of course, a difficult thing, right? I mean, if you're known as an animal murderer and a tiger murderer and all of those different things, then why not a human murderer? So you're kind of conflating the issues, and there's some rules there. So my question would be whether or not there was any attempt to sever the charges. The rule says that the judge can allow it or cannot allow it or may allow it, and so we just want to know whether or not it was allowed or not. We also are curious, I'm curious as to whether or not counsel was prepared for Joe's testimony. Were they prepared? If you're a defense attorney and you've got an indicator that your client's going to testify against your wishes, you can sit down and have a conversation with them, and you can say, you really cannot testify. It's going to be terrible for your case. Very detrimental, highly advised against it. If they're going to testify anyways, they have the right to do that. That's their right. They can go ahead and do that. They have a right to defend themselves. Nobody can take that away from you. As a defense lawyer, you should also be very prepared to deal with that, and you should have run through that. So this conversation should have been had many months before the trial ever started, and the defense attorneys can say, Joe, we really don't want you to testify, but if you are, here's going to be the most effective testimony. We can run through these questions. We're going to ask you these, or we're going to talk through these issues. We're going to prepare you for trial. Here's what you should be prepared for from the prosecutor's side. because they're going to get to cross-examine you. They're going to get to come in and beat you up for as long as they want about anything, any of these things that we asked you. And you got to be prepared for that. Otherwise, they're just, it's going to be even worse. So then the question is, well, were they prepared? Were they prepared? Did they blow this off? Was this something that happened sort of on the fly? Was Joe maybe sitting there throughout the entire pretrial process saying, I'm not going to testify, you guys know what's going on? And then Joe made sort of an executive decision at the very end and went and testified against their wishes, and that's why they stood up and made a record? Or what happened there? Really what happened? In my mind, the defense attorney should have been prepared for that testimony regardless of whether Joe's going to testify or not. And I think that, I probably would have wanted him to testify. It's just my thought on that, because I don't know how you explain the story without that. You can impeach them all day long, but the jury wants an alternative explanation. The explanation that Joe was actually asked to give that $3,000 from the cash register till over to Alan would be a pretty good explanation. And I think that with the proper impeachment of Alan Glover, with the calling of Jeff Lowe and impeaching him on that, I don't know what testimony happened with James Garretson. It's pretty sort of difficult to ascertain much of that. He keeps a tight lid on what the communication was, at least from the series. So it sounds to me like a lot more could have been done, but I just don't know. So that last point was, was the counsel unprepared for Joe's testimony? Maybe. And was the case not removed from from Oklahoma? Joe, this is kind of a small subpoint, not as big of an ineffective assistance of counsel claim, but Joe ran for governor. He ran for president. He was sort of a national celebrity to a certain extent. Late night comedians were making fun of him. Everybody sort of knew who he was, and they've probably been hearing about his antics for years, if not decades. So when Joe is now charged with the crime, I'm presuming this all happened in the district court, federal district court in Oklahoma. I'm curious as to whether or not that was actually removed from that court. So if you're going to have a criminal trial in a location where the jury may be poisoned, where they may have heard all about this and they've already come to a conclusion without hearing the evidence, it may be appropriate to actually remove that case or change that case, change it to a different venue. So it's an adjustment of the location. So if Joe's not going to get a fair shake in Oklahoma, which he may not, he may have people on the jury who love him. He may have people on the jury who can't stand him, but we just don't know. I think for a sort of a cleaner, fairer trial, it may have been a better idea to remove this to a location where there were less people who were so familiar with Joe's antics. Joe also, as he's going through, Joe's got some decent arguments. He's got some points that are made as we're going through. So number one, Jeff Lowe was not charged with a crime, right? So Jeff Lowe was the one who was coordinating a lot of this between Alan and James Garretson and, of course, Joe Exotic. So if Jeff was involved in that sort of conspiracy, he was not charged with a crime. Alan Glover was also not charged with a crime. And James Garretson makes a pretty good point as to this fact. He says the dude, if the government is to be believed, and we want to believe their facts, they're saying that Alan Glover was willing, able, and capable, and partially paid to go kill a woman. He accepted that deal and had already traveled to Florida to do it before he got cold feet. So this is a person who for $3,000 is just on the verge of murdering somebody, and they're not going to charge him with a crime. They're just going to say, you're good to go. I don't even know if he was on probation. I don't even know if he got anything. They're just going to use him as a witness, and they're just going to let him back out onto the streets, even though he was on the brink of literally killing somebody, according to their testimony. So that's a big problem. Alan Glover, truthfully, really never committed an overt act in furtherance of the plot. So even though there were some conversations being had, even though, Alan testified that he went to Florida, there's a lot of evidence to show that that's just not true. First of all, Alan did not get the full amount. So he wanted $5,000, but he only got $3,000. So we go back to the candy bar analogy. You can't buy half of a candy bar. You got to buy the full thing. Otherwise, the transaction is not complete. So the transaction between Joe and Alan was not complete. It was only $3,000. Unless Joe got a murder for hire discount or something, it's not the full transaction. Alan also never left Oklahoma, as far as we know. He never went to Florida. So he never did any of those things. So What was the overt act? Was it just Joe giving him some money? That's not even the full amount. There just wasn't enough there. What activity did he do on behalf of Joe that would constitute murder for hire? I didn't see any. I could be missing something, but I just didn't see anything. Joe Exotic also never committed an overt act in furtherance of the plot. So again, the $3,000, what he was asked to take that money out of the register by Jeff Lowe, and he gave it over to Alan so that Alan could leave. He could not get out of his hair, go to South Carolina. He wasn't working for Joe. They were having difficulties. So Joe paid him to leave. He didn't pay him to stay. Joe also, there's a number of things that Joe doesn't do, but the big one is that when he's communicating with the FBI or whoever the confidential informant was from the federal government, the prosecutor, Amanda Green, says very specifically in the series, he never did an overt act with the confidential informant, never gave him any money, never gave him any cell phones, never, none of that stuff. The physicality, the actus reus never took place there, which is why they dropped it. They dropped the whole thing. They said, no, the plot has ended. This isn't going anywhere. It wasn't until Alan Glover comes in and makes up this story that he's taking the $3,000 as a down payment to go murder Carole Baskin, and he's on his way to go do it, that an overt act is now alleged by the federal government. So Joe Exotic never really did anything there. The jury panel was also poisoned by commingling the murder for hire and the animal abuse charges. And there was some prosecutorial bias, some prosecutorial misconduct. The depth of the investigation here between Joe Exotic and Carole Baskin is massively different, right? Her husband goes missing. They're presumably dead. We don't have the FBI looking around. We don't have any of this sort of in-depth investigation that was going on with Joe. Joe was sort of getting picked on for years and years and years and years, and they were just trying to find a way for him to slip up. You saw that Amanda Green and the prosecutor's office was just sitting, waiting on an indictment. They were ready to go on it, but they didn't have enough. It wasn't until, boom, Alan makes up, the $3,000 murder for hire down payment, that the indictment then gets filed. So Joe was really kind of on the receiving end of a lot of abuse from the justice system. And as soon as there was a slip, as soon as they could connect the dots, they did so. So finally, I told you we were going to answer the question, right? I think we're pretty much clear as to where I stand on this, but everybody wants to know, did Joe commit murder for hire? And the answer legally is no. Joe Exotic did not commit murder for hire. I want to run through these different points. Joe Exotic did not commit murder for hire based on the evidence that I saw in the Netflix series. There may be external evidence that may change my conclusion on that at a later date. That's why I put a disclaimer at the beginning, and I'm putting a disclaimer on now. But from what I can tell from watching this series, there's just not enough evidence. Joe Exotic did not commit murder for hire. He did have every desire to see Carole Baskin dead. He did. He wanted her dead. There's no question. He did not, however, take any overt actions to actually complete the murder. Nothing was done in furtherance of that desire. So what we have is just the mental state and not the actus reus. We have a guilty mind, but we don't have any activity actually in furtherance of that offense. Now, Joe, throughout the entire series, he's making a lot of prior antics, a lot of jokes, a lot of body talk. We call this locker room talk these days, but they were not actual threats, according to multiple close witnesses. So this stuff here, he was throughout the entire series. We hear from a number of his friends, from Saf, from John Reinke. Everybody was talking about killing Carole. It would be better if she was dead. But it was just jokes. It was just locker room talk. They were not actually serious about doing it. And as we saw from the breakdown between the actus reus and the mens rea, that alone is not enough. Multiple people throughout the series have said Joe is just not capable of doing that. Were those people called into court or not? Doesn't seem like it. I didn't see that Saf or John Reinke were actually called into court. So big problems there. Joe Exotic, he transfers money to Alan Glover, but it's a legitimate business decision. It's meant to help Alan Glover move away from Oklahoma. So there is an alternative explanation to that activity. It wasn't an overt act in furtherance of a crime, in furtherance of murder for hire. It was just a regular business transaction. Jeff asked Joe to take that money out, give it to Alan, so Alan can get the heck out of here. Joe did that. That's not a crime. It's perfectly allowed, perfectly reasonable. It's a perfectly good explanation. Alan Glover never took an act in furtherance as he failed to go to Florida. Spent a lot of time on that. He just never actually went there. He testified he did, but there's a recorded statement that he would never go to Florida, not even for vacation. I think he's pretty unequivocal in that. The prosecutor's office definitely commingled those charges, and in my opinion, they poisoned the trial. So the jury was hearing a lot about Carole Baskin, about these animals, about euthanasia of tigers, Joe Exotic's, kind of history being a little unstable in relation to all of these different things, the abuse of the animals, the abuse of Carole, and so on, that they combined all the charges. The jury just wrapped it up in a package and said, Joe's a bad guy because of all these things, guilty across the board. So it was too much. It was confusing. It was misleading for that to happen. The trial was also not removed from Oklahoma. There were multiple other character witnesses who were not called on Joe's behalf. So we've got John Reinke, we've got Saf, we've got a number of other people who actually worked with him. Many people that I flew through in today's presentation were all people who were sort of on Joe's side. There were some people who did actually flip. So the last point there, witnesses against Joe were placed under duress in exchange for their testimony. I think that's absolutely true. We saw a lot of Joe's ex-husbands and former friends and everybody kind of come in because they were really scared that the federal government was going to just wipe them out. We had his campaign manager who said this was the scariest moment of his life. He got contacted by the authorities and they said, it's Team Joe or the team government? Which one are you going to be on? We saw Joe's husband, Finley, who said, I was with Joe for like 16 years. I don't know what I could have been in trouble for. I don't know what they could get me with. And so, of course, he testified. He's not going to prison. He makes a statement like that in the series, which is a pretty big problem. That a lot of these people who were Joe's friends, sort of his confidants, people who were with him for a very long time, just flipped. And that happens a lot in criminal cases because of the duress, because of the sort of the pressure that the government can put on you. They can say, you either cooperate with us and we'll give you a deal, or you don't, and you're going to be in the cell next to Joe. And many people, of course, they're not just going to say, take it or leave it. We're going to, I know what's true. People are inclined to really create stories and fib a little bit and bend around the margins, like we saw with Alan Glover. Okay, Alan was sort of coached through the conversation with Jeff, and in my mind, he was being manipulated to say what he wanted said, what Jeff wanted Alan to say. He coached him through it. If you say these things in the right way, in a way that gets Joe in trouble, you're going to get a good deal. You're going to get an amazing deal. Apparently, you're a hitman who's going to go kill somebody for $3,000 and you're going to get off scot-free. It's a pretty smoking deal to me. And the people who did testify, they just really weren't impeached. They no talk of the impeachment of the prior convictions, no talk of impeachment on prior inconsistent statements. The whole thing was just kind of a mess. And that's why the conclusion is that Joe Exotic did not commit murder for hire. Joe Exotic did not commit murder for hire. He's sitting in custody right now on a case of injustice. And so we're going to continue to talk about these issues. So I've got another whole handful of slides on the Carole Baskin topic. Did Carole Baskin murder her husband, Don Lewis, and feed him to tigers, which is a whole separate issue, kind of a different analysis, because in this analysis, Joe actually did go to trial and he did have the rules of evidence and he did have all of these different things that we can latch onto and discuss. Carole's case is a little bit different because how do you prove that something didn't happen well when it didn't happen well? There's kind of an absence of evidence that we cannot point to like we can point to here. So I've got my own mechanism for analyzing that, my own framework for that as well. But what I want to know from you is, was this helpful? Was this entertaining? Was this way too long? Was this in-depth? Do you want more of this type of content? I would love to know. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section. And absolutely would love a subscribe, because this type of stuff is fun. I geeked out about this one pretty hard, and I kind of enjoyed it. So we may be doing this again in the future, but only if it's valuable to you, only if you find it entertaining and enjoyable. So again, let me know, hit the subscribe button. There's going to be some other links to some other things that we're doing. We've got a pretty cool Facebook group. We do a live show for Watching the Watchers is the name of the show, where we hold law enforcement and police officers and prosecutors accountable. We do that on a weekly basis. I've got a book at beginningtowinning.com. That's available now. You can find it on Amazon as well. And of course, if you or somebody you know or love has been charged with a crime and you need some help, call our office. We handle Arizona cases. We've helped many, many thousands of good people get their lives back together and back on track. And hopefully we can help the conversation move forward on the phenomenon of the Tiger King and Joe Exotic. Again, please leave me a comment, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. I would love to see you again. I really want to thank you for sitting through this whole thing with me. I know it was a lot, but hopefully you found it enjoyable. Thanks again. We'll see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.